Okay, welcome and good afternoon. Thank you. Well, sure, we try that again. Welcome and good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Mary Cunningham. I'm the Senior Vice President for Research and Programs here at the Urban Institute. It is great to see everyone here for today's event, Combating Rising Evictions in the District of Columbia with Housing Subsidies. Before I jump in, I am going to read from just a few housekeeping notes. The event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online after the event. For virtual attendees, live captions are on and are adjustable at the bottom of your media player. In-person attendees, there are QR codes on the tables. You can use that code to submit questions, and the virtual audience can type questions into the Q&A box at any time. If you'd like to engage with us online, use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, and please, please, please complete the survey at the end of the event. We use these surveys to help inform our planning for future events. Okay, so with the logistics behind us, I want to again thank you for joining us. We're so glad you're here for the folks in person and also the folks online today. We are also incredibly grateful to Amazon for their grant that made today's event possible, and very thankful for Kellyanne Kirkpatrick, who's here today. Kellyanne is the Senior Product Manager of Grants and Partnership at Amazon's Housing Equity Fund and has been a great partner to Urban in advancing this work. For the last several years, Urban has worked to inform Amazon's Housing Equity Fund, which offers below-market loans and grants to preserve and create affordable housing in the company's hometown communities. Those include Puget Sound, Washington, Nashville, Tennessee, and Arlington, Virginia, and the greater Washington region. Here at Urban, our team works very hard to provide data and evidence to promote policies and practices that increase the availability of affordable housing and increase housing stability for people in communities, people at all incomes. Today's conversation focuses on preventing displacement, a key focus of our work, and it aligns our commitment to DC and our region embodied in Urban Greater DC. The Urban Greater DC aims to address inequities and create a region of shared prosperity. Our work with the DC Eviction Prevention Co-Leaders Group, that you'll hear more about shortly, aims to strengthen DC's ability to distribute federal emergency rental assistance to those who needed it, and created a broader framework for eviction prevention in DC. We also recognize that we have folks today joining us from all across the U.S., a lot of the folks who are joining online. We hope that today's presentation and discussion will give you some ideas about how you can better support the people in your communities. So I'm excited to see what we'll learn from today's presentation and conversation, and thank you all again for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Kellyanne and invite her to provide opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mary, thank you for that and for the kind words and the continued partnership that Amazon has been able to have with the Urban Institute. As was just shared, my name is Kellyanne Kirkpatrick, and I have the tremendous privilege of being the lead for grants and partnership for Amazon's Housing Equity Fund. Historically, I've shared that Amazon's Housing Equity Fund is Amazon's more than $2 billion commitment to create and preserve over 20,000 units of affordable homes across our 3 hometown communities. That, of course, is the Puget Sound, Nashville, and right here in the National Capital Region. I say historically because I am elated to share that just last week we announced renewing that commitment and the fact that we had not only met that goal but exceeded it by over 1,000 affordable homes. So Amazon's Housing Equity Fund is now a $3.6 billion investment to create and preserve affordable housing across our regions. We know that we can't do this work alone, and that's why we invest in ensuring that there's good information to help policymakers, to help advocacy groups, to help residents navigate what we know is a really important issue for them. So I just want to thank, again, the Urban Institute for the continued partnership and their tireless work on these issues, as well as the panelists and everyone that's joining us in person and virtual today. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leah Hendy, a researcher here at the Urban Institute. I'm so glad that you could join us in person and online to consider what housing assistance levels we need to support DC tenants with low incomes so that they can remain stably housed and prevent eviction and displacement. In our brief that was released late last week, we will be sharing findings from shortly. It was inspired by the many conversations that we facilitated with the DC Eviction Prevention co-leaders group over the last 3 years. The group, I should note though, that the research is the work of my colleagues, Elizabeth Burton and Peter Tatian and myself, and does not represent the views of the Urban Institute, the group of co-leaders, or any funders. The DC Eviction Prevention Co-Leaders Group is co-convened by the Greater Washington Community Foundation and the DC Bar Foundation, and facilitated by us at Urban, and has representatives from several DC agencies, including the Department of Human Services, DC Superior Court, legal services providers, and housing counselors. And you'll hear from 2 of the members of the group on the panel in a few minutes. I want to recognize the passion and dedication of this group to finding solutions for tenants in crisis in DC. It's been inspiring to be in conversation with them over the past 3 years. And I want to thank the Community Foundation for their leadership on this issue and support of Urban to facilitate the co-leaders group. We also thank Kellyanne and her team at Amazon Housing Equity Fund, as well as JP Morgan Chase for their support over the last several years. The co-leaders group first came together following a White House summit on eviction prevention in the summer of 2021. Initially, we were focused on expediting the federal emergency rental assistance through the Stay DC program, but we've been meeting weekly ever since. We landed on a shared vision to prevent both evictions and displacement and to help tenants remain stably housed. Together, we developed a collaborative framework for eviction prevention in DC. That framework lays out a cross-sector approach that we think is needed to support tenants and help them stabilize. It includes access to emergency financial assistance, access to eviction defense, as well as broader housing supports. Reducing housing instability, which includes preventing evictions, is not simply about preventing the loss of a physical space for an individual or family to live. When people with low incomes struggle to pay rent, they are forced to make trade-offs with other basic needs. This might mean spending less on healthcare, rationing food or medication, or investing in fewer enrichment opportunities for their children. Research has found that people with unaffordable rents are more likely to struggle with mental health, including anxiety and depression. Being evicted is a devastating event, worsening one's health, increasing residential mobility, and potentially leading to homelessness and job loss. It makes it more difficult for people to secure safe and affordable housing in the future. Not only are individuals and families better off if they are living in housing they can afford, the benefits extend to everyone in the community. High rates of housing cost burden negatively affect the regional economy. For example, higher housing costs may deter new workers and businesses from locating in DC, in addition to displacing lower paid workers here already. Property owners are struggling with the increasing rental delinquency rates, even for properties with rental subsidies. And these high delinquency rates may limit their ability to fund services and capital improvements, and to financially sustain the operations of the properties, potentially putting them at risk of foreclosure or sale. Though many of the challenges resulting from the pandemic have receded for most residents, it's become clear that the housing affordability crisis that DC faced before the pandemic has not. For most renters in DC with very low incomes, the rents are just too high. Nearly 60,000 renters with very low incomes at 50% of the area median or below have unaffordable rents, a group we would consider to be housing cost burden. This income level is a maximum of about $57,000 annually for a single person to $71,000 for a family of 4. Of these households, 40,000 are paying more than 50% of their monthly income in rent. That is their severely cost burden. This graph shows you the percent of renter households at each income level that are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. About 82% of those with incomes below 30% of AMI have unaffordable rents. This goes down a little as incomes increase, but still about 2 in 3 renters with incomes between 40 to 50% of AMI are cost burden. Housing insecurity disproportionately affects Black and Latino residents in DC. As many have documented, including our former colleague, Kololo Kijakazi, these inequities stem from a long history of racist policies and private practices that have stripped wealth from Black people and communities, excluded them from jobs and benefits, and segregated our communities. Other urban colleagues conducted a representative survey of DC and found that young people, Black and Latino residents, households with children, and residents in Ward 7 and 8 disproportionately experience higher levels of housing insecurity, with unaffordability being the most common reason for housing insecurity. Many were worried that following the lifting of the eviction moratoria in FY22, there would be a wave of evictions that would quickly follow. But with some changes in policy, federal resources, and close collaboration across government and the social sector, many of these evictions were prevented. However, with even more local emergency rental assistance resources than DC had pre-pandemic, we are estimating that the number of executed evictions, that is those that are carried out by the U.S. Marshals Service, will come close to the 2019 levels this fiscal year. With large shares of households with very low incomes struggling to pay rent and rising evictions, we need to consider what resources are needed to stabilize housing for all residents in DC and prevent future displacement. This includes emergency rental assistance, but other types of housing assistance as well. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Elizabeth Burton, who's going to walk through 3 categories of housing assistance, the need for each type, and additional resources to support those.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. As Leah discussed, with evictions on pace this year to reach pre-pandemic levels and the high share of cost-burdened households in DC, an increase in housing assistance resources is needed to prevent additional evictions and further displacement. Our analysis takes into account the need for deep subsidies, shallow subsidies, and emergency rental assistance to be fully funded and effectively work together to fit residents' needs. We found deep subsidies need an estimated increase of $380 million a year. An expansion of shallow subsidies would cost an estimated $153 million, and ERAP would need between $76 and $108 million a year. First, I'll provide background on the 3 types of housing assistance, then I'll describe how we came to these findings. First, deep subsidies, which we define as covering the gap between what a household can afford to pay, 30% of their monthly income, and the actual cost of rent for households at 30% area median income and below. In 2023, around 29,500 households in DC received a deep subsidy. A few examples of deep subsidies, and the largest being the Federal Housing Choice Voucher Program. In fiscal year 2023, more than 12,500 households in DC received a housing choice voucher, and these households rent eligible housing units from private landlords, and the subsidy moves with them. More than 5,000 public housing units were occupied in 2023, which is an occupancy rate of only 68%. Our analysis also included other federally funded deep subsidies, including project-based vouchers and programs targeted to specific populations. In DC, around 7,000 households received a subsidy from the Local Rent Supplement Program, or LRSP. LRSP is similar to federal vouchers, where households pay 30% of their monthly income towards rent, and there's both project-based and tenant-based subsidies. Shallow subsidies we define as a set amount of rental assistance that helps households between 30 and 50% area median income afford their rent, and these often end after a certain time period. DC Flex is a local innovative program where households receive $8,400 annually for up to 5 years in flexible funds to be used towards rent payments. Currently, households at 40% AMI and below, and those exiting rapid rehousing are eligible. And then third, DC's Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP, helps cover a few months of rent once a year for households at 40% AMI and below, and who are facing a financial emergency or a threat of eviction or homelessness. Deep subsidies, shallow subsidies, and ERAP should work together to ensure DC residents are stably housed. We framed our following estimates around this principle, right-sizing the estimates based on household incomes and sizes. We estimate that more than 26,000 additional vouchers are needed. To calculate this estimate, we used the American Community Survey microdata and subtracted the number of households at 30% AMI who receive a current local or federal deep subsidy from the total number of households that have incomes at or below 30% AMI. We estimated $380 million in funding to cover these additional vouchers. We calculate an average cost of around $14,500 for each additional voucher based on the gap between households' monthly rent and 30% of their monthly income, amounting to the $380 million for the ones we estimated. In total, $800 million is needed for current federal and local vouchers and the additionally needed vouchers we estimated. We added the fiscal year 2023 budget allocations, $249 million for housing choice vouchers and $169 million for LRSP with our $380 million estimate. We estimated 16,700 households need shallow subsidies, and these are the number of households between 30 and 50% area median income who are cost burden. And a majority of these households are between the 30 and 40% AMI. A note that this estimate assumes a major expansion of DC's current shallow subsidy DC Flex because it's all of households between 30 and 50% AMI that are cost burden. We estimate $153 million to fund these shallow subsidies. We calculated that by multiplying the current DC Flex amount, $8,400, with our estimate of households and included a 9% administrative cost. And last, we estimated $76 to $108 million for ERAP, which is based on current program regulations. ERAP alone would not solve housing instability for residents with very low incomes and would need to be funded alongside deep and shallow subsidies. In addition, people with housing subsidies will still have emergencies, shown by households who receive a voucher or live in public housing currently accessing ERAP. We estimated this number using the Census Household Pulse Survey public use files and found that an estimated 18,500 renters in DC are behind on rent and have very low incomes, and an estimated 13,000 renters are 1 month or more behind on rent or responded very likely or somewhat likely to be evicted and have very low incomes. We use these household estimates to create the range of ERAP funding by multiplying the 18,500 households and 13,000 households by around $5,800, which is the average ERAP cost per recipient in fiscal year 2023, and this also includes administrative costs. Our analysis found that housing assistance programs need significant increases in funding to meet residents' need and prevent further housing instability. Renters cannot afford their rent across the country, with the number of housing cost burden households at an all-time high nationally. While additional federal resources and housing assistance would provide needed support for DC residents, our analysis provides an avenue for DC to locally address housing instability. And with that, I'll welcome my colleague Peter Tatian, who will be moderating a panel of experts working to prevent eviction and displacement here in DC. They will be discussing our findings and offering suggestions on how to better stably house residents. Thank you.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Peter Tatian, Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute, Research Director for Urban Greater DC. It's great to see you all here in person, and welcome to all our online guests as well. Thank you to my colleagues Leah Hendy and Elizabeth Burton for that great opening presentation, and to Elizabeth in particular, who did a lot of the work behind the numbers that you just heard about. But we're very delighted to have this wonderful panel here today of folks, many of whom have been working for a very long time to try to support people in the District of Columbia. And so we're really privileged to have you with us as well. So I'm going to first give you all a chance to just quickly introduce yourselves. We do have bios for everyone on the event webpage, but just a little quick introduction and perhaps say a little bit about your work and how you're working to help support residents of the district.
Hi, I'm Kate Coventry. I'm the Deputy Director of Legislative Strategy at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. DCFPI aims to shape anti-racist, just policies and centers Black and Brown communities in our research, our community partnerships, and in our advocacy. And I work on homelessness as well as lead our budget work. A major part of our work is to get more resources into the DC budget for people with low and moderate incomes. I'm also a voting member of the DC Interagency Council on Homelessness. That's the group of government, nonprofit, advocate, provider, and people with lived experience, business, and philanthropy who come together to shape DC's homelessness policies.
Great, thank you, Kate. Daniel?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Del Pielago. I am the Housing Director with Empower DC. We are a grassroots organizing group here in the District of Columbia that works with low, moderate income Black residents of color in the district to really identify the issues that are affecting them and helping them think through how to push back, fight back through organized efforts. Recently, we've been doing a lot of work around eviction prevention and how we can help connect folks to legal resources, but also in general, growing their knowledge of how to, better navigate those very turbulent waters around eviction. We also focus a lot around subsidized housing here in the district, namely public housing, where we try to do the same work to preserve and improve traditional public housing.
Good afternoon. I'm Marion Siegel. I'm the Executive Director at Housing Counseling Services, serving the metropolitan area. We are a direct service agency working with tenants, home buyers, homeowners, and households experiencing homelessness to access and sustain housing that's most appropriate for them. Our work in eviction diversion, I've been a member of the co-leads group since its inception. I am an original ERAP provider from when the program began, a member of the Judicial Landlord-Tenant Working Group, and we as an organization have individuals in every eviction hearing to ensure that tenants facing imminent legal action have access to resources and are connected to appropriate services. As a homeless prevention organization, we also work with tenants who are in buildings that are experiencing poor conditions, that are up for sale, that are impacted by conversions to prevent displacement. And a resource of NOAA properties, our goal is to prevent the loss of NOAA properties as well as other properties that our clients live in.
And sorry, Marion, just maybe for those who might not know NOAA, could you?
I'm sorry, naturally occurring affordable housing. Properties, we're in effect, we believe we're losing more naturally occurring affordable housing than we're keeping pace with development of new affordable housing opportunities.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Hello all, Rebecca Lindhurst. I am a managing attorney at Bread for the City's Legal Clinic. For those joining virtually, Bread for the City is a DC-based nonprofit organization that provides food, clothing, medical, legal, and social services to alleviate the burdens of poverty and organizes and advocates to find justice for those in our communities. I manage Bread for the City's housing law practice, and we provide eviction defense representation for tenants who are facing eviction. Bread for the City and I personally believe that housing is a human right, and that all residents should have all resources they need to live in DC and continue to live in DC.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So let's start off just, you all heard the research that Urban Institute has prepared. I'd like to know your thoughts about that research in terms of what struck you as being most important, and is there anything in particular you'd like to make sure people take away from that work? And maybe I can start with you, Kate, if you don't mind.
Sure. So the first thing is research that you cited, which was about how difficult it is for people who are cost burdened to make ends meet. There has been some rhetoric around the emergency rental assistance program that people are abusing it. And in fact, people are just making choices with the very limited resources they have, right? So, you know, they can't afford medicine, they can't afford food because the rent is so high, and so they're applying to ERAP. The second thing I was struck by was the scope of the problem. I like to quote David Bowers from Enterprise Community Foundation Partners, because he always says, why are we bragging about spending millions on $1 billion problem? But according to this paper, it's not $1 billion, it's 609 to 641. So that seems more doable. So I'm feeling more hopeful than I have recently.
That's great, okay. Daniel, how about you?
Yeah, similar to Kate, I think what I was struck by was that 58,000 number of district residents who are, unable really to afford their rents, and seeing that plainly laid out along with what it'll take, to me is really important. I know Kate's been through it, we've all been through it through the budget recently, but it appears, and I think, how the budget played out really has shown there appears to be some changing values in what gets funded in the district. And we saw a very poorly invested in housing budget. So I think, and Marianne, we're talking about this, we were early birds and we got here early, but having these deeper conversations are going to be so important, because we are really seeing a confluence of eviction levers here in the district. And ERAP is not going to be the solution alone. So we do need to broaden how we're looking at the problem and the solutions that are needed. And I think this is hopefully a good starting point.
Well, I think the first thing that I noticed, as a housing counseling agency, a direct service agency, we're always bumping our heads against unit counts and the number of units being built and the number of units being lost. And I always like to remind people to get back to focusing on the individuals that live in those properties. I think that the report talked pretty clearly about the individuals' real incomes who are experiencing risk, and the importance of looking at what the report didn't quite get to. And I think it's a great beginning point for conversation. What the report didn't compare it to is what is the cost if we don't do this. And that's the continued conversation that we hope to have in the co-leads group and the many other groups we're in. So where $500 million might sound expensive, it might not be so when we compare it to the alternatives. And I'd like to continue that conversation.
I think we've known for a long time that the solution to the problem is money. Over the last 2 decades, we've watched as rents have risen at a pace much higher than incomes have risen. And as Marianne noted, we've lost almost all of our naturally occurring affordable housing in the district. So as rents continue to rise, incomes remain stagnant and people just can't afford the rent. I think the changing conversation that I really would like to see is to get away from this idea of affordable housing, because I think that term gets tossed around a lot and doesn't really mean what I want it to mean. This conversation is about subsidies. And I think changing the discourse to talking about subsidies versus affordable housing at low-income tax credit rates that people can't afford anymore we really need to shift the conversation to subsidized housing and away from affordable housing, and I think that's really important.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. And I want to remind the audience here, you can use the QR code on the table if you want to pose questions to the panel that I'll get to later, and folks online, you can put questions in the QA box. So we started talking a little bit about ERAP, and Kate mentioned some of the discourse that's going on around ERAP, which I know has been concerning to a number of us. Marion, your organization, of course, deals very directly with people who are applying for ERAP. So what can you tell us about the kinds of people who apply for ERAP? What kinds of emergencies do they have? And
I mean, I've been involved with ERAP since its inception, and when it was originally designed, it was designed for a short-term imminent emergency that caused you to be at risk. As fewer and fewer opportunities existed for tenants, and certainly through the pandemic, it's broadened the appeal to anybody at current risk of homelessness or eviction, which in the terms of ERAP means if you're 30 days behind, you qualify. The narrative of fraud is not what I've experienced in any way. The narrative we see is the rent is too damn high, that people can't afford rent at its current levels. And so individuals applying for ERAP might be a school teacher that needs a new transmission on their car to get to work, or it might be somebody who's living on a fixed income who literally, who might even have a rental subsidy, but had a glitch happen that made it impossible to even pay their portion of the rent. We see everything. And as individuals, tenants who are 30 days behind in ERAP at 40% or less of income qualify for ERAP. We do not see that people are making decisions to apply for rental assistance when they don't have an emergency. What we do, in fact, see is that since rental assistance is one of the few financial assistance programs available to many people, that a household might decide to pay their medicines, pay for more food, to pay for the new transmission, rather than to pay their rent, but they're all life necessities. And so the connection to ERAP is, it is the resource available, and people access it reasonably.
great, thank you. And I welcome if others on the panel have any thoughts about this question, about the use of ERAP. I'm happy to let you chime in. If not, I can.
Yeah, I'll say that I am deeply troubled by the narrative around ERAP, and I have no qualms saying that people are relying on ERAP. And for all the reasons Marion just said, you know, when you're living at 30% or below of the area median income, the choices you make are just that. I think it is irresponsible to make cuts to a program because one person may have committed fraud. We don't see that. Our clients don't commit fraud. Marion doesn't see it. So I am okay with saying that people who are living at very low incomes rely on ERAP year after year, because living on a low income is incredibly difficult. And I don't have, you know, I have never had to make those choices. And I think a lot of us in the room are also similarly situated. So to say that people shouldn't access ERAP, given whatever life circumstances, I think is really troubling to me.
As the data person kind of on the panel, I also want to say, like, if you're going to claim there's fraud, you need to show there's fraud. You can't just say there's fraud. It's not, that's not how this works, or should work, I should say. And I'll just also say that people are surprised that more people are applying for ERAP. We should not be surprised at all that more people are applying for ERAP. Rent is way, way up since before the pandemic. People are aware of the program who might not have been aware of the program before because it was a much smaller program, and everything is too damn high. Food costs, medical costs, all these, the inflation we've had, people are feeling squeezed. Like, we shouldn't be surprised that more people are applying.
Just I'll just add, once again, you know, it's really disconcerting that it perpetuates this racist trope that low-income Black people, people of color, you know, are gaming the system. They don't want to find any other way to work, or, you know, that they're just dependent on this thing, when really it's people are figuring out how to survive. And when you need to survive in a city that is just super expensive in many aspects, things like this happen. Unfortunately, you know, we're in this, I won't get on my political soapbox, but we're in this kind of time now where it's very easy just to say something without backing it up. And the more you say it, people will buy into it. And that's what's really dangerous, when the larger community who isn't immersed as much as we are, not that we're any better, but they're just not immersed in this, starts to believe this, and it perpetuates these inequities that have unfortunately plagued this country for a very long time.
Yep.
Can I add something in? Is
Yeah.
that one of the reasons I think we're all here today is in the co-leads group, we've talked about ERAP inside out and backwards. And I believe ERAP has expanded beyond what its original intent was. But the concept is there is no alternative. And I think that the whole purpose of this report was to look at what are the alternatives to having ERAP try to be something for everybody, because it's going to fail. It cannot meet the needs of the tenants nor the property owners in DC. So what are the alternatives? So I don't think that any of us here think that ERAP should be what it is, but it's the only game in town right now.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for that. Daniel, if I can go back to you. So, you know, I've been doing work in DC for a long time. Affordable housing has been one of the things I've talked about since the very beginning, and your organization as well has been working for a long time to support people in DC. Is there something, from your view, that is unique about the time we're in right now in terms of housing affordability? What would you say about, you know, kind of the current situation for affordable housing in DC?
I don't know if there's anything super unique, because I think there's always been poverty, and there's always been, you know, people who just can't afford rent, can't afford insurance, can't afford food. I think it's just looking a little different. And once again, I think it's kind of, we're in this society, once again, you say things and they become truths. So, you know, what I think is important for us, and what we often hear from the folks that we work with is, and I appreciate that you all use this language in the report, that it is a crisis. I mean, people call us, and I'll share a brief story. A man called us recently who is in the rehousing program, and he's a month behind in rent, and I found myself having to say, well, they can't take you to court just yet, which is like not the best help that folks can get. But he was so worried about, he's been on the streets for many years, and he finally has this place, and he desperately needs to hold on to it. And this is the pressure that folks are under. So it's not just like, I need to find some money to pay this rent. It's like, once again, people are in this survival mode where, you know, the times are really weighing on folks because there is, you know, this pressure. And once again, we're seeing a change in values from this administration and the city leadership, where there appears to be, and I've said this on other panels, a disposable class. There are people that can be pushed out of the city, and we're accepting that, right? So I think those are some of the real issues that we hear from folks on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you. Since we're talking about kind of bigger systems, and of course, Rebecca, oftentimes when folks get to see someone like you, they are in that situation where they're facing, you know, an eviction proceeding, a legal proceeding. From your point of view, the point of view of legal service providers, you know, how does that look? I mean, is the process fair to both landlords and tenants that we have in DC for kind of trying to resolve those non-payment of rent cases?
Peter, that's a complicated question.
Yes, well, we have time.
I'll start out with points of agreement. I think we can all agree that DC has laws that are very favorable for tenants. We have protections against eviction that are some of the best in the country. There are places, people on screen who know that tenants can be evicted in 3 days in some jurisdictions. So DC is unique in the protections that we have for tenants. The court strives to create equity in the way cases are heard, in the systems that are created for both landlords and tenants. Marion and I are on a committee, landlord-tenant working group, that meets with the deputy presiding judge and others, presiding judge, landlords, attorneys, and legal services providers to talk about how the court is functioning, how to ensure that everybody has equal access to the court. The court has taken suggestions from people, tenants, attorneys. We have, for instance, worked on the message that is delivered at the beginning of a hearing. The judges are very good about giving out the hotline for tenants and landlords to connect with legal services providers. Recently, the court made a change after listening to some landlord feedback that they needed a faster process for tenants who allegedly were causing threats to the health and safety of either the building or other tenants. And the court answered that feedback with a process that allows landlords to move a little bit faster. We get space in the courthouse. We have an office, legal services organizations have an office where we are actually present day in, day out at the courthouse. So there are lots of things that the court does to make the process fair. But I think it's all a false narrative. We live in a country where the rights of landowners, the rights of property owners are far superior to the rights of all others. It's what our country is founded on. Whether you bought the land or stole the land, we have upheld the rights of landowners for the entire existence of this country. And as we think about Juneteenth coming this week, and the promise of 40 acres and a mule, and redlining, and the history that our country has seen, I don't think we can ever have a court that is equitable, truly equitable, until we have housing as a human right. And especially in DC, where our court has been created so as to only give standing to landlords. It is called a landlord-tenant court, but only landlords can bring suit in that court. And it has been that way since its inception. So, Peter, I don't think it can ever be fair.
Okay.
I think for all those reasons, I think it will forever be an unfair system.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for that frank assessment. I think it's very important for people to hear the points that you made. And I know that there's also been some complaint that we've talked about in the co-leaders group about the length of time it takes for court cases to get resolved, and the court, as you pointed out, has made improvements there. But also, I think this is important to me, that some of those things that take longer are because tenants are getting more opportunity to participate now because of the virtual hearings. Could you say a little bit more about that, maybe just for folks who might not know?
One of the things that came out of the pandemic was a virtual courtroom. When court opened, initial hearings, landlord-tenant proceedings, when the moratorium was lifted, they held hearings in a way that allowed more people to access those hearings. Prior to the pandemic, tenants were defaulting at a rate of around 50%. That would be 50% of tenants who had been sued did not show up for their court case and got defaulted. Now that default rate is significantly reduced. Tenants are not defaulting because they can merely log in on their phone and respond to the court case. There have been improvements in service. Landlords are now required to take a photo when the summons is posted on a tenant's door. So we know tenants are actually getting notice of the hearings that they're needing to attend. And so the decreased default rate, the court is now hearing cases on the hour. You're not being scheduled at 9 a.m. and sitting in court till 3 p.m. waiting for your case to be called. You're there at 9, your case gets called usually between 9 and 10. Your case is set for 10, you're usually heard between 10 and 11. So it is not as much of an inconvenience for people to assert their rights as tenants in a case. So these are basic due process requirements that we've inserted into our court system. Landlords and tenants have an opportunity to mediate. The mediation process is typically done within the first 6 months of the case, within the first 6 months of the case. So these things can happen quickly. What we've lost, though, I will say, is the quick resolution in a face-to-face situation. So when I'm in the old days, before COVID, when I was in the hallway of the landlord-tenant division, I could walk up to the landlord's attorney and say, hey, my client can pay an extra $200 a month for the next 10 months. Is that okay with you? Sure, it's okay. Let's write it up. Case over. We've lost that connection, and I think that has led to cases lasting a bit longer than they used to. And I think the communication between landlords attorneys and tenant attorneys is not as smooth as it could be. And I think it's resulting in a lot of delays when those parties aren't speaking.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. And thanks for those of you who are submitting questions. I'm seeing some come in now, so please continue to submit your questions, and we'll get to those in a moment. Marion, can I ask you to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges faced by people who are being helped by housing counseling services for whom the rent's just too high? What kinds of things can you help them with, and what other help do people need?
Sure. Well, when we came up with the eviction prevention framework as a co-leads group, we thought about pretty much 4 different areas, how the simplified version of it, which is access to justice, access to financial resources, access to other support services, and the importance of data in connecting the dots. And so it's the other resources that housing counseling services really focuses on. And what we look at is you can have all of the financial assistance in the world. If your income is too low, it's going to be a merry-go-round. It's going to be a repeated process. If you have access to justice, it might delay your eviction, but ultimately, if you can't resolve the delinquency, you're going to end up being evicted. And it's the access to the other services, the housing counseling, the having somebody look at all of the resources that you might be eligible for, might put together as a salad for a solution. That becomes important. And as a housing counselor, it's important to look at where is it that you personally can make some changes in your life? Where can you access economic opportunity? And here we are talking about housing subsidies and emergency rental assistance, but this really all stems from the fact that people don't have access to good economic opportunities to increase their income, so that we don't have to have this discussion. So a housing counselor or other social service supports can help people look more holistically at a life change that can take them out of this situation without the rental subsidy or the emergency rental assistance.
Great, thank you. Again, welcome. Any other thoughts anyone might want to add to what Marion has said? But all right. Thank you for that. So, Kate, so we're talking a lot about subsidies, about money that's needed here. And, DC, like many places around the country, is going through some financial difficulties right now. And, the latest budget negotiations, illustrated that. And also there's been cuts that were proposed or made to a lot of essential programs. So is it just crazy to think that we can put more money into housing subsidies? What do you think?
Well, you'd think I'd be more negative given the state of the current budget. It's the worst budget on housing probably in 10 years. Definitely the worst budget for individuals experiencing homelessness in 10 years, since the mayor's been the mayor. But it's not crazy at all to raise revenue. We are an incredibly wealthy city. We do not tax wealth. Other states are taxing wealth. Massachusetts, for example, recently, and I wrote this down, $1.8 billion they raised on an income tax. The council did a very minor mansion tax if the assessable value is 2.5 million or above. It only raised 5.6 million, but if we had put that at 1.5 million as the threshold, we could have raised $50 million. And I just want to say that when I printed this paper, interestingly, I was using the backside of Polling Briefing, DC voter attitudes towards tax policies, flyers from our recent event. And the thing is that DC voters overwhelmingly support both housing, increasing investments in housing, and raising taxes on wealth. So 92% of DC voters said that they want to increase housing support for people experiencing homelessness and build and preserve more affordable housing. And then, between 78 to 69% support either a expanded mansion tax, a tax on high income earners, and a capital gains tax. So I don't think it's crazy at all. This is not, I would say too, this is like a multi-year effort. So getting a mansion tax this year is the start of it, but we definitely can increase revenue to meet human needs.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to hear you're not giving up yet. That's great. I don't think we should give up. Well, this is actually, so just to start getting into some of the questions from the audience. Someone asked that it's clear that a great amount of financial and political investment is needed, and addressing the underlying structures is going to take time. So what are some maybe, and I think you've got to start on this, Kate, like what are some short-term goals or things we should strive for versus some longer-term goals to try to get to where we want to be?
Obviously, like implementing this number of vouchers would be a challenge. There are really true implementation concerns. Lease up for vouchers right now is slow but improving. We've cut it in half in the homeless services system. I think immediately we could think of things like having a housing supplement. Some states have, if you're on temporary assistance for needy families, benefits for families with children, that if you don't have affordable housing, you get a cash payment to go towards your rent. We have something in the district called Schedule H. It's the worst name ever, but essentially it is a property tax break for low-income homeowners and renters even, because the idea is if you're renting, you're paying that property tax in your rent. So we could expand that as we slowly move to this large number of vouchers, and then we won't need these other things, and we can scale some of those other things back.
Great. Any other thoughts in the panel of what would you like to see us tackle in the short term?
I just recently, this past Wednesday, the Housing Authority had its monthly Board of Commissioners meeting, and there was a conversation about their voucher utilization rate and how people are getting their vouchers, but actually leasing up is an issue. And there was this strange conversation, because if I'm not mistaken, in the District of Columbia, if you have a voucher, a landlord is required to accept it as your method of payment, right? But there was this whole conversation around landlords not wanting to take vouchers because the voucher holders, will tear up the property. So an idea came out from the director of, why don't we look at starting a fund to hopefully pay back the landlords if they tear up the property. So to me, it really spoke to like some of these agency leads and these folks don't really understand the power that we could have if we just followed the laws and rules, and instead of providing corporate welfare, as a colleague of mine shared, would be to really identify these bad players that are keeping people from accessing housing. And once again, this troubling idea that low-income people just want to tear up housing and leech off of it. So I think that is going to be really important in the short term and long term as well, but to really help have a better understanding of what protections people have, what rights people have, and talk about that instead of all of the deficiencies that you know people perceive come along with low-income folks who need help for housing.
We also have that on the homeless services side. So folks know there's like the housing authority wait list process, and then there are people who are experiencing homelessness and shelter on the streets. And we actually do have a fund like that, and from what I understand, it's not used very often. So I think that points to the fact that, like, again, if you're gonna claim something, you should have to show data that backs it up.
Historically, actually, under Michael Kelly, previous director of the Housing Authority, there was an insurance policy that was used for landlords to, if the security deposit didn't cover any damage, that would, so that concept's been around for a long time. I have a couple of other thoughts about things we can do in the near term. I am disappointed in the decision of the Housing Authority to use vouchers that have been use vouchers for families exiting rapid rehousing in the district. For those of you who don't know, there are about 2,000 families who are being exited from the rapid rehousing program with no subsidy in place, no future assistance in place. And the DHS, Human Services and Housing Authority, have gotten together and are using some of the vouchers, the local or federal vouchers, to give those vouchers to people exiting rapid rehousing. And I don't begrudge those families getting these vouchers. What I do take issue with is robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? There is an infinite number of vouchers, and if we are taking vouchers from one population who needs it and giving them to another population, that still leaves a waiting list for people who need vouchers. And as we know from the presentation, there are lots of people who need vouchers. So that is troubling to me that we are, sort of moving the deck chairs, so to speak. The other point I wanted to make was around public housing. We, as of 2023, only 68% of our public housing units are occupied. And so that is a huge number of public housing units that are offline. We've allowed them to deteriorate. We've allowed those units to become uninhabitable. And should we invest in bringing those units back online, there would be a significant number of units available for families who need them. So bringing those units online, I think, should be an immediate priority toward getting families housed.
And then finally, again, sticking with the tenants who already have subsidy, really exploring a little bit more about why would it be that a quarter of recipients of ERAP are getting some other type of income-based subsidy. So what is causing that? We know part of that is due to recertification process that is not user-friendly and that is difficult to achieve from time to time. There's many reasons. There's reasons that tenants choose not to recertify for other reasons, but why is it, and we also know that if your income is very low, even if you pay 30% of your income on housing, that doesn't leave enough for other basic needs. But how do we address the fact that for some people, even a subsidy isn't resolving their circumstances? If you have a subsidy and you have a death in your family and have funeral expenses, you can't pay your portion that month. There is no solution, again, other than relying on ERAP. So stop using ERAP to resolve everything and look more holistically even at the recertification process.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the audience about DC's immigrant population, and whether immigrants who live in DC are using the housing assistance to the extent they could. I wonder if folks, I'm sure folks have thoughts about improvements that could help immigrant populations get better housing stability.
In terms of ERAP, regardless of your language or your immigration status, you are eligible for ERAP. Is ERAP easily accessible to everybody? In theory, yes. In practice, no. You know, in theory, HCS alone has 6 languages on staff. Do we always have the right language for the person who's faced with an emergency at that given moment in time? No. Does DHS make effort to make sure ERAP providers make sure that limited English proficient applicants have access to services? They attempt it, but there's always going to be some limitations.
And to be clear, people who do not have immigration status are not permitted to access any of the federal housing programs. So they are excluded from public housing and federal vouchers. So there is no stealing of resources by immigrants in any of the federal programs. DC happens to be a city that welcomes migrants, and so I know we have put some resources toward that. I don't know exactly what they are. Maybe somebody else knows.
So there's a difference between being an immigrant and being a recent migrant. So recent migrants, I don't know if people have heard, but some lovely governors have sent us buses of migrants as a political statement, and those folks are actually excluded from most homeless services program. There's a separate Office of Migrant Services, but it is not as robust as our homeless services system. If someone has been here for a while, they qualify for locally funded local rent supplement vouchers, just like anyone else, but you have to be on the list, and we actually have to have vouchers going to list, which we will likely not have. The Housing Authority hasn't finalized the transfer of the vouchers to rapid rehousing families, but so those are 2 different populations to the housing and homelessness systems.
Right, thank you for explaining that distinction. That's very important. Another question was about the way we framed our analysis in our report. It's really about subsidizing tenants' rent, or the ability for the tenant to pay the rent, versus subsidizing their income or subsidizing the properties. So I wonder if anyone on the panel has any thoughts about the pros and cons of doing subsidies in different ways, or thoughts about that.
Well, I always use the example of during the mortgage crisis when financial institutions received the subsidy to resolve their economic crisis, yet homeowners lost their home. And I fear the same thing would happen in the case of tenants. Were landlords to be protected and subsidized, I think individual tenants would still lose out.
I think one of the most common phrases we hear when we're on the properties, in the buildings, doing outreach and flyers is, do you got a job? Can I get a job? Can I apply to something? So I think once again, pushing back against this narrative that folks just want to be subsidized. Like they just are waiting for, the superhero government to come in and alleviate all of their issues. People are looking for work. People are looking to, to add on, to bring value to the city. So I think that needs to be really explored a lot more is, what are the other opportunities to help folks, kind of get on their feet and move up the ladder, as it were, and not just, kind of perpetuate this idea that folks just want to stay where they are. Like that's just far from the truth.
Yeah, I would just echo every time I meet somebody experiencing homelessness on the street, they ask me about employment, and unfortunately I don't have a lot of great options for them, particularly if their literacy isn't high. I think realistically, we need both tenant vouchers and project-based vouchers, at least for people experiencing homelessness. During the pandemic, the Department of Human Services had this program, PEP-V, which was hotel rooms for folks who'd been experiencing homelessness who were at risk, high risk of COVID. And what we found there, what was found there was that some people really thrive in a community. And for the example, some of these folks haven't cooked in 15 years, right? They've been homeless or in and out of shelter. So some project-based vouchers where people can be in community if that's what they want. It's really about client choice in that regard. But I agree, like helping in employment would be great, because I really, really feel for people when they ask me, and I have really very little to give them.
Yeah, I have a client who we've been working with since the fall, and he's gone to every job fair. He's gone to every, I send him flyers. And he can't find employment. He's a returning citizen, and so we've, add that to the mix of people who can't find housing. I will say the vouchers versus project-based. So the vouchers are quick, right? You can get them in people's hands quick, relatively quick. You can get them in people's hands. You can get them on the street. Project basing takes longer. If you're actually building, right? If you're building a new complex, a new development, I think that at one time there was a program at the Housing Authority to project-based vouchers in already existing housing that is either being rehabbed or tenant purchased by tenants. And we used vouchers in several projects where we wanted to ensure long-term affordability for the residents there. So we were able to project-based vouchers in existing properties. So that's something I don't think has been done in a very long time. So I think in terms of longevity, it takes a very long time to get new housing built. Sure. And I know multiple developers that want to create affordable housing communities just can't do it because they've gone in for trust fund money year after year and been denied. And it's just, there just isn't enough housing preservation affordability money to go around. And that's a whole nother can of worms that we could talk about.
Absolutely. That could be another event. So we've referenced the homeless prevention system a number of times, and we have in DC a comprehensive plan to end homelessness. So one question I got was, do we need a comprehensive plan for housing stability?
Is that from Silvana?
Hi, Silvana. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I'll say that because of the scope of the problem, I think there's very little political will to do a plan. There was a comprehensive housing strategy task force, I believe in 2006. This was before my time at DCFPI. Yep,
you are correct.
And they called for the creation of the local rent supplement program, and they essentially called for about 1,000 vouchers, tenant and project, each year for 10 years. They didn't even make it the first year, right? Like if you the first year in your plan you can't get it funded, your plan is doomed. I mean, and then they re-met at some point while I was at DCFPI, but I was not on that task force because I'm more on the homelessness side. But that report had no targets, and with no targets, there's no teeth. So on the homeless services side, we are also not going along with our plan, but at least I have something to point to be like, this is why we're falling behind. These are the numbers we need. And so I think if we need a plan, but it needs to have all the tools, because like we said, we can't get 25,000 vouchers out the door in a year. So, I could see a very ambitious plan that would kind of pair these things and phase things in over time so that in 10 years, we met the goal.
Kate, I'll one-up you. One of the first things I read when I moved to DC and began doing this work was the 2001 task force plan.
I'm not familiar with that one.
I think I was on that.
You were on that one.
I think I was on that one.
So we have had many task forces over the years, and I don't think we need to study the problem anymore. I think we know the solutions, and we just need the political will to make it happen.
I think also, I mean, all of us up here and in the audience have been in a million meetings about this subject. One of the things I'm recently saying in the million meetings I go to is that we all have to step out of our corners and work as a community to look at a public policy solution. So, you know, the housing providers need to step out of their corner and stop the narrative of the welfare queen. The tenant services groups have to step out of the corner and only look at tenant rights. I mean, we all have to step out of our corners and work as a community to come up with a public policy solution that we could all back up and try and advocate for that will. But I think we also get stuck in our own vision of the world.
So, yeah, I think that leads into another question we had, which was really specifically about budget cuts and what can be done to oppose the cuts. But I think we're also talking about, like, not just opposing cuts, but actually advocating for more where it's needed. So what would you say to folks in the audience here, online, like how can they help support these ideas if it's something they want to get behind, the idea of having more comprehensive resources to address housing stability?
Well, the budget's over for this year. For the Budget Support
Too
Act,
late.
which is the implementing language of the budget. So unfortunately, our opportunity for more money in this budget is over. As I have been mourning, literally mourning, the state of this budget on housing, I am getting revved up because we are going to do an amazing job next year, and we are going to make them realize that this is a crisis that they need to commit to. In DC, I know we have people from all over online, but there's the Fair Budget Coalition as a resource for people wanting to advocate for more housing. There's the Way Home campaign, that's for the campaign to end chronic homelessness. And then there's JustRecoveryDC.org, and that is the campaign to raise revenue to pay for human needs. So those would be three places I would encourage people to check out. And I guess I would just say, in DC, there are a lot of events with council members. Council members have office hours in the ward. They've got Brandon Doe's having a pool party. Like, show up at those things and tell them that you're concerned about housing. When I go out in the world and I meet strangers, I tell them what and they ask me what I do. I tell them what I do. And the first, almost like 80% of the time, it's, can you help this specific person who is homeless, who's sleeping outside my office, or, has come by and I've given him lunch a couple times, but like, I can't help him. I believe we are a compassionate city. I believe we are a city that believes we should correct the racial ills of the past. I think we can do it. It's just people have to actually come out and do it. It's not convincing people. It's more convincing people to do the actions that we need to do.
As we ramp up, because the budget year is over, but we have another year to try again. One of the focuses that we really, something we really want to focus on is really telling the stories of tenants, right? Because there are, these small windows really where we can raise up tenant experiences during the oversight hearings or the budget hearings, and then if we are able to coordinate enough time for council visits. But so we really want to step up, creating a platform to share the stories of people that are directly affected by these policy decisions that have been made. So we really want to encourage folks to share their stories, be brave, and demand what they really want and need, and to be at these tables, right? To be a part of these decision-making conversations that are happening, because they are the ones that are living it, so they can really inform what needs to happen. So we really want to focus on that over the next couple of months.
I would say for those that are lacking in compassion, which there are some,
Yes.
I think there is also a way to present as self-interest. That everybody benefits if everybody is stable and happy and comfortable and living a good life. So I think there's a way of putting a little bit of self-interest in it as well.
sort of piggybacking on Daniel's point, I practiced in New York for a short time, and there are very strong tenant communities in New York. There are tenant unions in every single neighborhood, and they are a strong lobby. They have power in influencing the New York City budget, the New York State budget. There's a trip to Albany every year of New York City tenants, and I think that's something that I continue to look for in DC. We continue to work toward building in partnership with Daniel and others, but really letting folks know that they have a voice. They have a voice in this budget, and I can go down to the city council and testify every single opportunity I get. I can knock on council members' office doors. I can run into Phil Mendelson in the grocery store. But it is not my voice that's needed. It's the voice of the people who are most affected. At Bread, we like to say those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so just really looking toward communities to have their voice heard as we move forward.
Yeah. Thank you, absolutely. So I'd like to kind of bring this to a close now. So it's been a great conversation. Want to give you all one last chance to wrap up, say anything you'd like to the audience to take away from today's discussion. Who'd like to go first?
I guess I can start.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, so I mean, as we close, one thing that really always kind of doesn't help me sleep at night is when I have these conversations with our leaders, like folks who are, dealing with quite a bit, but still step up and, attend the hearings, attend the meetings, is why are they doing this, right? Why are they doing this? So I think I would encourage those decision makers and ourselves in general to really help folks organize themselves so they can have more of a political power in this. So really making sure, it's just repeating what I said, but really making sure that folks who are directly affected have a stronger voice in all of this and don't have to deal with this despair. What I also appreciated was the tie to just your health, right? Going to sleep every night, not knowing if you're going to have a place to sleep in the very near future, can really affect your mental and physical well-being. So I really hope that we can create those spaces, listen more, and really, take that direction and take that lead, because, when a sports team wants to leave, we do everything we can to keep them here. That's just facts, right? So there's a whole bunch of Washingtonians that don't want to leave. They want to stay here in their city, and we need to find ways to keep them here.
I think hearing Daniel's mention health is as one of the original medical legal partnerships at Bread for the City. We talk often about the social determinants of health, and housing is at the top of that. And so that for me rings true. I also think it's a racial justice imperative. I think that we've talked around it, but I think if we are going to achieve racial equity in our city, which I think people want, that we need to take some bold steps, acknowledge the racism that exists in the systems that we perpetuate, and do better. I've been in DC for 23 years now, and live in Ward 6, and I see it in my neighborhood. I see folks leaving, and I think we need to do better.
I'm glad this report brought some laser focus to actual numbers, but to recognize that each of those numbers is a human being who've experienced some kind of disaster and some kind of solution. I mean, there's 8,000, I think it's 8,000 some odd ERAP recipients who might have otherwise been homeless, should be looked at as individuals, and the 8,000 some odd others who might have been turned down for assistance, we need to recognize that they went a path that was probably not so great. So it's both using statistics to inform public policy, but not to forget that each of those numbers represents a human being.
And I'll just wrap up by saying I focus on chronic homelessness, and these are individuals who've been homeless for a long time and have serious health conditions, and they literally die from diseases that I know people in this room have that they're able to manage and or prevent because they're in housing. And we're talking about, like, you don't have access to a bathroom, so you can't take the heart medication that makes you have to go to the bathroom, or you can't refrigerate your medication. And our government found only 148 vouchers for those folks. And just so people have kind of a perspective, we have like over 800 people living outside right now, and 2,000 people who fall into the chronic homelessness category. So it is a social determinant of health, and for some people, it's the determinant of death. And I keep that in mind every day when I do the work that I do. And it doesn't have to be this way. And I think, like I said, like all of us have said, most people in our community do not want things to be this way. So if we all do what we can, they won't be this way.
Great, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for the great discussion today. And yes. And thank you to the audience here, the audience online. Please do fill out the survey to give us feedback on the event. That's very important, it does help us improve things. So thank you all very much for joining us, and please have a wonderful, safe rest of your day.